Welcome back to Otaku no Video. As always, thank you very much for joining me for part 2 of my primer on Leiji Matsumoto, particularly his works involving space pirate Captain Harlock. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Captain Harlock is more of an action-adventure story. It was a manga initially, which Matsumoto started in 1977, and it was then adapted into an anime I believe a year later. And the idea of Harlock is that he is this dashing space pirate who is basically fighting against a government that he sees as oppressive, and there's lots of other bigger stuff going on. What's interesting about Harlock is that he is a young adult, actually. He looks to be like in his late 20s, early 30s. I don't quite know what age he's supposed to be in this particular series. And this was pretty unusual for anime and manga at the time. Usually the protagonist is about the same age as the target audience, so that they will identify with that protagonist. Harlock is older, and he has a tragic past. The neat thing about Harlock is the fact that a lot of his big adventures are already over. This is kind of telling the story of the consequences and after effects of some of the stuff that Harlock did earlier in his life, which, again, quite unusual in anime and manga. So this was quite popular anime series when it came out, and it spawned a movie called Arcadia of My Youth. This was a really big deal. Not only was it a self-contained movie that told an original story, actually it's about Harlock's youth, literally, and it was also very popular. It made a lot of money, and it showed that anime could make money, especially anime films, and that well-structured anime films. I think it's actually a self-contained thing. Also, Arcadia of My Youth made it over to America at the time. So in the early 80s, American anime fans were able to get a hold of that and watch it. So it became one of those sort of fundamental texts of early American anime fandom. In fact, it was so popular, that movie, that there was a TV series spin-off of that made in 1983, which told its own stories of Harlock's youth. Then in this is the amazing thing, in 1998, we get our next Harlock thing. Yes, there was a dry spell of almost 2 decades. For some reason, despite how popular Matsumoto's works were early on, there were almost no anime works done spinning off those stories until the late 90s, basically, in both the case of this and in the case of Galaxy Express. But it kind of jumped back in with Harlock Saga. Now, this is the story of Harlock and other characters, but as readapted through the story of the Ring of the Nibelung, the Wagner opera. Yeah, the opera. Space opera. Huh. And so that whole story of this ring that was forged is very powerful, and people have to, find it, and then it has to be destroyed. That gets told through Captain Harlock and his characters. And before you're wondering, no, this was not based on Lord of the Rings. Ring of the Nibelung was many centuries, actually, prior to Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. Anyway, so that was an OVA made in 1998, which was a lot of fun, available in America. And in the same year, saw the release of Queen Emeraldus, an OVA that took a minor character in Harlock, who's basically a space pirate captain of her own, or at least someone on the run of her own, and gives her own story. Now, this is interesting because most of Matsumoto's works involve male protagonists. Very rare to see a strong female lead, and Emeraldus is definitely a very strong female lead. And so you get this neat little story of her being a piratical type character and running around and dealing with injustice in her own way. Then, a couple of years later, we got Cosmo Warrior Zero. This is a spin-off story set as a sequel to the main action of Harlock, in which a man from Earth's military is specifically tasked with hunting down Captain Harlock and bringing him in. The problem is that Zero, the main character, kind of respects Harlock and struggles with his duty to bring Harlock in and kind of sees what Harlock is doing. So it is a big epic action-adventure series with this interesting struggle between duty and what Zero knows is right. I've seen about half of the series. I will warn you that this, as well as the next series I'm going to mention, were made in the early 2000s, back when anime budgets were very low, and it shows in these series. It can be sometimes tough to watch. They're quite inexpensively made. But In fact, the next series we'd see in 2002 was Gunn Frontier. This is based on, interestingly, a manga that Matsumoto made in 1972. Yeah, long time ago, even before he started doing Captain Harlock. At that point, Harlock had been mentioned in various Matsumoto works, but as a little side character, he popped up in cameo works. But this was the first work in which Matsumoto actually made Harlock a main character. But in this case, it was in the Old West, the Wild West of America. And it introduces several other characters, which would then be part of the main Harlock mythos later on in Captain Harlock. So anyway, very interesting series. Again, inexpensively made, but it worked, and it actually got a really good dub cast. So Gunn Frontier came out in 2002, and probably because Matsumoto wrote his first novel in 1999, that was Gunn Frontier 2, which was a sequel to the main action of the original Gunn Frontier. And pretty cool stuff. And so you get to see Matsumoto's characters in a Wild West world, with a few little sci-fi elements in there, but almost entirely Wild West. You also get to see the Wild West through a Japanese person's eyes, which is interesting. A couple years later, we got Harlock the Endless Odyssey, which is a movie release, which actually I don't know much of anything about, other than the fact that it existed. And then we also got an announcement just recently that there is work being done on a CGI live-action Harlock movie. This is going to be in the same vein as the Space Battleship Yamato movie that was announced recently. And a pilot has already been made, and concept art has been done, and they're moving forward on making that. Also getting an all-star cast of anime people working on this particular production, so it should be quite interesting. Shinji Aramaki, the guy who did Appleseed and all the other stuff, big folks. So that's been the main stuff spinning off from Captain Harlock, who is a really fun character, interesting world, interesting stuff going on. So that's pretty darn cool. Harlock's a lot of fun. In the next episode of this primer, or primer, however you want to pronounce it, I'll be talking about Galaxy Express 999, a rather different kind of franchise, which has seen a lot of other very interesting kind of spin-offs going in lots of other different directions. So that's coming up, and stay tuned.